Welcome to my video about discourses. Discourse, I think, is a pretty difficult topic. It's a sophisticated concept, and so in this video I'm hoping to simplify it a bit and unpack it, provide a clear definition, and also relate it to some other key terms. So here's my definition of what a discourse is. It's not the only definition out there, but I think this one will serve us quite well. So I start with the idea, this first sentence. A discourse can be thought of as an ongoing discussion that is distributed throughout a society. So let's unpack that a bit. We'll just go through it in order. So the first point there is that it's ongoing. A discourse isn't something that's just a one-off event. It's ongoing for decades, or even, I was thinking about the idea, the discourse surrounding gender roles has actually been going on for thousands of years. Though it has had a particular tone or had particular importance, I guess, at particular times and in particular societies. So it's ongoing and it's a discussion. If you think of a discourse simply as being like a conversation, but instead of that conversation being between two or three people, sitting around a table, sharing ideas, sharing opinions, debating, arguing, instead of the conversation happening in that small form, it's actually distributed throughout a whole society. And so that means that lots of different groups, individuals, organizations, commercial companies, media organizations, they are all participating in that one discourse. They're all contributing to that one conversation. It's spread throughout the entire society. And the last thing I want to point out is that it is in a society. We had before the word ongoing, and now we've got a society. When you're thinking about a particular discourse, you need to think about it in a specific time and place, because the discourse surrounding gender roles in England in the 1200s is very different to the discourse around gender roles in America in the new millennium, for example, or Iran in the new millennium for that matter. Let's keep going now, and I'll unpack it further to think about some other specific concepts that are inherently related to discourse. So a discourse will reflect the society's values and will also shape the society's values going forward. Usually it will include debate between conflicting values. Okay, so a value is simply a judgment or a belief about what's good and what's bad. It's an attitude about what's right and wrong, important or unimportant. So a discourse will reflect what the society believes is right, wrong, good, bad, important or unimportant. It will reflect the society's values. Because the discourse is taking place in society, so obviously the beliefs in that society will be reflected in the discourse. But what you also need to realize is that the discourse can also shape the society's values going forward. Because the discourse is like a conversation, and when you're having a conversation, your opinion can be changed over the course of the conversation. You can be presented with new information or be convinced through a good argument. And so the values not only are reflected in the discourse, but the discourse can actually shape the values. So we go backwards and forwards. We have a two-way relationship in that way. Let's go to the next part. Usually a discourse will include debate. It will include debate between conflicting values. And that's because, well, when does a conversation become really important to people or to a society? It's when there's debate over it. It's when there's conflicting ideas that are strong and they are coming into competition with each other. In 2016 in Australia, one such example is the gay marriage debate, or the gay marriage discourse surrounding gay marriage, because there are large groups in society who want to see the legal definition of marriage changed to allow gay couples to marry, and there are also groups in society who oppose that for various reasons. And so that's a discourse that's hotly debated. It's a really important discourse in our society in 2016 in Australia. Going on to the last point now, we are thinking about this in terms of media. So how does media and discourse go together? Well, media texts are made within a society and they feed into the discourse. reflecting values through the construction of representation. So we've got a few important ideas there. First of all, that media texts are made within a society. So obviously, if they're made within society, they reflect the values and opinions and the important ideas from that society. So the fact that, using the example I gave before, that gay marriage is a discourse, an important discourse in our society today, means that the people in our society are thinking about it, and so they are creating media products that relate to that discourse in either subtly or overtly. And so the media text made within that society has an opinion about that discourse, about the ideas in that discourse, and it feeds into it, becomes part of that distributed conversation. It becomes one of the ideas that is fed into the discourse, one of the voices in the discourse. And I've also got there that it reflects values. So values are contained within a media text. The producer of the media text, either deliberately or unconsciously, will present their values through the construction of representations. So you've got to remember that representations are constructions. They are deliberately made by a producer. There's a process where they're deciding how to make it look, how to make it feel, who to cast for an actor, what color to use in a particular scene. So the representation reflects the values, and the representation then is fed into the discourse. Remember, representations can be a whole range of different things. They can be people, they can be objects, they can be locations, and they can actually be values themselves. You can actually reflect a value almost directly. So obviously all of that contained in a representation feeds back into the discourse. So lots of big ideas there, lots of important, sophisticated concepts. I wanted to have a go at representing it visually now. I want to see if I can draw some connections and hopefully make it much clearer, or perhaps present it in a different way that might be clearer for you. So when I'm thinking about a discourse, I'm thinking, where does a discourse start? And in my opinion, and this is all my opinion, my take on it, in my opinion, it starts with some kind of historical event. Or you could just think of it as just where society is at a particular time. So what's important to that society? What's what's the zeitgeist? What's the mood in that society at that time? I like to start there and say that's our starting point. And from there we can say, okay, well, out of this historical event comes an issue, or directly particular values. So let's give that an example. For a historical event, I was thinking 9/11. I was thinking the planes, the terrorist attack against the Twin Towers. I didn't really, I was a pretty ignorant, naive 17-year-old. I had never really thought about religious extremism and radical jihadists and Islamic extremists. Those terms weren't really in my vocabulary. But as soon as that historical event occurred, this new issue about how do we respond to terrorism, how do we respond to radical Islam came up. And for some people, they instantly, from that event, had very strong values. It really shaped the values in the society as soon as that historical event occurred. So you put these two ideas together, and of course they feed into each other. The issue shapes people's values, and the values feed into the sort of issue. And really that all goes down into the discourse. So that's how I like to think of it. We start with the historical event or what's happening in society. That creates these things that are important, the values and the sort of issues that are relevant to that society. And they then feed directly into the discourse as that issue is debated, as those values are presented. That forms the discourse. Now, of course, there's a number of ways to feed the ideas into that discourse, and one of them is through media texts. So media text will feed into the discourse. They will present ideas and be added into the discourse. And they could, of course, be, newspaper articles or TV shows, events. I mean, for me, going back to the example of 9/11, what was really interesting after that is all the bad guys in American movies stopped being from Russia and they started being um, from Middle Eastern countries because that reflected the discourse at the time. Now, there's also a connection over here because values and media text come together in the representations. I just gave the example of the villains in a TV show like 24, which came out shortly after, in the early millennium, shortly after the 9/11 attack. And so the representations of who the bad guys are not only are shaped by people's values, but but are embedded within media texts. And so those representations are embedded in the media text and they feed into the discourse. Now, what's interesting about all this, of course, is that it goes two ways as well. So media texts feed into the discourse, but they're actually also coming out of the discourse because what's important to people at the time, what's happening in the discourse is determining what goes into the media text. It's determining the values and it's determining the representations. And so it's all this nice, I'm going to scribble all over it now. It's this nice big loop going round and round as people are presenting opinions, they're presenting values. That's influencing the discourse. That's shaping the media texts, which are coming out of the discourse and also feeding back into the discourse. So that's my diagram trying to make sense of a whole bunch of terms, how history and society leads to issues and values, how they feed into the discourse, and how the media texts as well feed in and come out of those media texts. I hope you found that helpful. This is just my take on it. You might completely disagree. You might emphasize certain things, or you might present it in different ways. But I'd be really interested to know what you think of my idea of how you can visually represent a discourse when you're studying them in terms of media texts.